Double Fine is one of gaming's most fascinating mainstays, if you could call them that, having somehow clung on to life since the early 2000s despite a history of low sales, in part due to a very passionate fanbase. That's not a slight against them, they're quite good at what they do, but their first two games, which were larger budget projects, had sales so abysmal that the first crashed their publisher, Majesco, and caused them to drop out of gaming entirely a few years later, although Advent Rising certainly didn't help, and their second almost crashed themselves when EA cut ties, at which point the studio worked exclusively on small-scale downloadable titles, largely for Xbox 360 Arcade for several years, even turning to crowdfunding several times, and largely popularizing its usage in the industry, a blessing and a curse. The studio was founded by Tim Schafer, who spent his early career writing and directing classic LucasArts adventure games, Monkey Island, Day of the Tentacle, Full Throttle, and Grim Fandango, although as the adventure game genre fell out of vogue, he would go off on his own to make games in a variety of genres, although those games would often hold on to those adventure game roots. They're wordy, full of the trademark LucasArts humor, and often straight up include adventure game elements with inventories full of puzzle items. That brings us back to Double Fine's first game, Psychonauts, an action platformer with adventure elements. It's wordy, funny, and has an inventory full of puzzle items, and it's the game that crashed Majesco. Initially an Xbox exclusive, meant to be published by Microsoft themselves, leadership changes at Microsoft caused it to be dropped, and while it would still come to the Xbox, it would also see a port to PS2 and PC, and in later years would hit digital storefronts on the Xbox 360 and Xbox One, as well as the PS3 and 4, so it's decently available. In many ways, Psychonauts has most of the elements of its action platformer contemporaries. The main character, Rasputin, or Raz, has a double jump, a 3-hit combo, and works his way through a variety of colorful and wild stages, facilitated by him entering the minds of various other characters and experiencing their subconscious, an idea partially carried over from a cut segment of Full Throttle, where the main character was sent to a dream world on a peyote trip. Raz is a psychic, and as such also has a variety of other abilities, a simple projectile which can be fired by locking onto targets, which allows him to strafe around them, very much like the 3D Rayman games, levitation which lets him float over hazards and greatly increases the height and length of his jump, with a hover in air that further extends his jump and lets him float upwards on rising wind, confusion grenades that stun enemies, clairvoyance which lets him see through the eyes of other characters, invisibility which is invisibility, pyrokinesis to light stuff on fire, and shield to not die. These are joined by a sort of awkward leveling system where collectibles in this game all feed into it. From simple figments that level up slowly over time, to trading cards that jump your level up big time in exchange for 9, cobwebs that turn into trading cards, emotional baggage which levels you up when you collect all of them in a level, and also give you adorable little cutscenes, and brains which raise your max health. And as you level, you slowly upgrade the effectiveness of all of your abilities, and even gain some new ones, like passive healing, which are nice benefits, and collecting stuff is fun and rewarding because of it, but it can also be a lot to manage, especially as cobwebs and cards need to be turned in manually. The adventure game elements are mostly in the form of the inventory, where you gather items of all sorts. Sometimes you'll need to show a key item to a character to get them to talk to you, or gather a new key item that serves as a literal or metaphorical key, and there's some that have individual uses, like the cobweb duster that collects cobwebs. There's no inventory limits, and you can't waste items, so it's not cruel like the really ancient adventure games such as King's Quest or something. But it's a fairly present element to the game, one that isn't overly complicated or difficult, but that adds a nice extra layer to the whole game and definitely separates it from its cousins in the genre. I will say, Psychonauts ain't the best feeling in its genre. It's far, far from the worst, but it does feel a bit stiff. Raz is a touch floaty by design, he tends to slip off of rounded edges very easily, and outside of levitation, every ability, including the basic 3-hit combo, halts his movement. And God knows that combat is not that strong either. The act of attacking is usually at least a few free hits on you. It can be a touch frustrating. However, the gameplay isn't a one-man band here, so its weaknesses aren't a game ender. Everything around that stuff is so immaculate that it's really, really hard to knock it. That's a nice segue to the presentation, and oh man, does this game nail it. Psychonauts is as fantastic looking as it is strange. The character designs are really something, ugly mostly, but in kind of an interesting way with wonky proportions, shapes, and striking silhouettes, plus some frankly bizarre voices. It comes together to form this delightfully warped reality of exaggerated personalities that make the game feel inherently dreamlike. Our main man is voiced by Richard Stephen Horvitz, who has been in a few hundred things, but is likely best known as Zim from Invader Zim and Billy from The Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy. He's a man with a distinctly grating voice, but he's dialed back pretty heavily as Raz, and works really well given the silly and odd material. The worlds are obviously the standout though, as is typical in the genre, but especially for a game as weird and creative as this one. Every area has a twist on the game's already rich art style, loaded with detail and with a sort of waxy artificial look, even in the fairly sane campground hub, but it goes absolutely crazy in the mind worlds. Black Velvetopia is within the mind of a Latin American painter and takes on a very Spanish tone. The buildings and surroundings are all dark, if not outright black, but highlighted in gorgeous neons and other bright colors. Even Raz's outfit is touched up with some neon to highlight it. Waterloo World takes place, in part, on a tiny game board that heavily resembles Catan with its hexagonal tiles and small figurines and models that are proportionately huge. But Raz can also nearly seamlessly hop off of the game board and return to full size, which feels very impressive. And you can even find the players at their board within the tiny game world, which is really trippy and fun. And the Milkman Conspiracy is a non-Euclidean suburbia, a twisting neighborhood in the void that goes over, under, and above, with later portions dangling in the sky above you, while cardboard cutouts of secret agents disguise themselves in simplistic costumes, and surveillance cameras hop out of trash cans. The game is constantly reinventing itself, and it's very hard not to be impressed. The writing also deserves a lot of credit. The game is perfectly silly and fun, not so much full of puns or quips or anything like that, but deriving humor from odd situations and straight reactions to it. Lungfishopolis is huge for this, literally. A city populated by tiny little lungfish who see Raz as a massive kaiju destroying everything, constantly interrupted with propaganda broadcasts that discuss the strength of the Lungfish Navy. Then, when that's ineffective, the Lungfish Navy's aerial division, and so on and so on. And of course, there's the Milkman Conspiracy. It's the most well-remembered segment of the game for a good reason. Boyd's paranoid, randomly generated rambling has some hilarious results, and Raz's deadpan reactions are even funnier. And the inept government agents disguising themselves as construction workers by holding up stop signs, standing in the cemetery talking in monotone voices about the inevitability of death, and disguising themselves as assassins at a book depository tie it all together.
Sometimes I work for the government.
Comedy is hard to talk about. I can point at moments and say, damn, that's funny. But really, it's funnier if I don't. But it's easy to say that it's an incredibly charming and funny game. The music is as varied as the game's levels, too. It feels like an insult to call the soundtrack silly, but I do mean it in the best way. The soundtrack has fun, giving each new mental world its own unique flavor. Lungfishopolis has a legally distinct but extremely recognizable play on Godzilla's main theme. Black Velvetopia has what can only be described as the most Hispanic song ever, and Milkman has a comically bouncy song that makes the world seem like an idyllic small town, like something out of Leave It to Beaver or something. Even the finale has this wacky violin music played as a circus theme over hard-hitting drums. You get a little taste of everything, and every element of the game has its own killer flavor, every bit as wacky and weird as every other segment of the game. I will note that the PS4 emulation is far from perfect, at least not when played on the PS5. It might be better on the PS4, but I'd be surprised. It's largely good enough, and it's completely fine in dark areas. However, light areas, like the campground itself, do have some shaky lighting. Shadows will jump around or vanish, the contrast seems a bit off. It's not terribly frequent, and the game's art style hides the flaws really well, but it may be best to look into other versions where this is less of an issue. Unusual for the genre, Psychonauts begins in a fairly long cutscene, and I suppose it would kind of have to, as the concept requires some explanation. The Psychonauts are effectively superheroes, a team of psychics who save the world from, basically psychic supervillains. All the game takes place at a summer camp for young psychics as a form of training for future Psychonauts. Each of the teachers are given a quick intro too. Milla is the empathetic one, Sasha is the brains, a bit stoic, and Oleander, with his World War I era German helmet, is the hard-ass coach, but he's still softy deep down. And these guys are pretty constant presences and mentors for Raz in the early game, and each have a mind world that explores them a bit deeper. Raz himself is snuck into the camp. Some of his story comes later, but the short version is that a fortune teller cursed his family to die in water, hence why he can't swim, and it's caused a lot of disdain for psychics in his family of circus acrobats, so he's fled to join the Psychonauts. From there, Raz is kinda just dropped into the campground hub, and it's a serviceable hub. For most of the game, it lacks enemies, and the map is really not helpful in getting around, and I never quite got used to how all of its 6-ish areas connect together, although there is fast travel via hollowed tree trunks to make it a bit easier. A lot of the hub is pretty superfluous. Between actual levels, there's usually some kind of puzzle to solve, and that's quite fun. But a lot of it is fairly broad forest, where exploring nets you some cards and arrowheads used as currency in the lodge to buy a few upgrades, including the mandatory cobweb duster, but also cute little things like a range increase on grabbing arrowheads and health pickups dropped from enemies, and the ability to change the color of some of your psychic attacks. The shopkeep is Ford Cruller. He's also the janitor, a boat captain, and the head of the Psychonauts. He's fairly unimportant for now, but gains a lot of relevance later, and is a fun guy in his own right, playing a lot of roles and coming off as a bit of an airhead, but being the glue that holds the whole organization together in the background. The campground does its job well enough, connecting the actual good stuff together, but I never really connected it as deeply as a hub like Delfino Plaza. Much of it is empty and exists for level grinding, plus the entire back half of the game takes place in one small area of the map. It's functional as connective tissue, but not all that exciting to explore. All that finally gets us to our first level, Basic Braining, Coach Oleander's tutorial for young Psy Cadets. While largely a very basic tutorial on the platforming, it has far and away some of the funniest moments in the game, as most every section has another student getting horribly killed attempting what you are. The world is framed as a World War I battlefield, interconnected trenches, bombs, minefields, and death. It's a very grim start to the game in a starkly hilarious way. Through most of its runtime, level's fairly straightforward, featuring basic platforming to get to grips with the controls, simple combat tutorials, and a bit of exploration for figments, but doesn't go off the rails until the very end, with a kinda neat spiraling platforming segment that, while brief, leaves a solid first impression. Between levels, there's some time to kick around the campgrounds. The first interlude is mostly used to introduce the head of the Psychonauts, Ford Cruller, who mechanically at least is the go-to for progress, giving you new powers and occasionally gatekeeping progress until you have enough levels to get a mandatory power. You never need to go that far up the level tree. Invisibility is learned at 30 out of 100 and is the last necessary move, but it further incentivizes scouring each inch of a level, which is appreciable, I guess. There's a lot of games in this genre that have collectibles that do nothing. After some doing, Sasha is looking to test the Brain Tumbler, a device that connects its users to the astral plane to explore their own minds, and which takes Raz into his own subconscious. This area heavily foreshadows many later events, and Raz is forced to return here with new abilities several times as he gains new abilities to push forward, and has some really neat visuals of its own, taking place in a warped, dark world with eggs made of static, an evil tower made of thorny vines, and a rabbit that guides you, much like Alice in Wonderland. Very quickly, Sasha pulls Raz out, telling him that he's not going to make it far without some combat training, which leads to Sasha's mental world, Sasha's shooting gallery. Much less his subconscious, and more so a constructed training world, which is a fun bit of character showing the mental control of the masters. That said, the shooting gallery is an extended tutorial for projectile combat. It looks kinda cool with the black and white thing going on, and being able to walk on the faces of the cube is an impressive trick. Even the little bit of platforming introduced later in the level is in service of reaching more dudes to shoot with the unexciting ranged combat. After hitting another wall in the Brain Tumbler, it's time to learn levitation inside of Mia's brain. While equally a tutorial level as Sasha's brain was, Mia's dance party hides that fact much better. For one, levitation is fun. It carries momentum, like Sonic, and there's a lot you can do with that, especially in this area's various sloped rooms and half-pipes, where gaining some speed lets you get extremely high, even skipping some sections outright. The game honestly could have laid way more into this and I would have been completely ecstatic, because I think the momentum-based stuff is very fun and sort of underutilized. Floating through the air with levitation is also decently fun and gets some cool uses as well, although it's certainly not as freeing as going Sonic is. It all gets paid off with a real nice finale too, where instead of a boss or something like that, it ends in a race where the name of the game is wrangling momentum, going off jumps to hit shortcuts and going fast. I honestly wouldn't have minded more of this either, although it would be a little out of place if it reappeared. The stage itself also has a really nice theme with a laid-back disco vibe, again showing the stability of the masters, although it's undercut with an infamous secret. Hidden off in the stage is Mia's darkest memories, as shown in her emotional baggage, where she failed to save children from a burning orphanage who now exist in her mind as nightmares in a cage who cry and beg for help in children's voices. It's very creepy, unnerving, but also says a lot about Mia that she's able to compartmentalize the trauma and guilt so well, which contrasts heavily with the less stable characters that the endgame is primarily composed of, although those levels do also tend to be the more interesting ones, to be fair. Another power learned, another trip to the brain tumbler with one final obstacle, mental cobwebs. This segment contains some of the game's more flagrant padding, not egregiously so, maybe an hour, but the cobweb duster needed to remove them is rather pricey, and your only real method of getting there is to utilize the dowsing rod, which makes extremely obnoxious noises to indicate large caches of invisible arrowheads to get there. It does give you a chance to explore the campgrounds a little more thoroughly, find stuff for the scavenger hunt, which gives you some levels if you find them, or cards to get some extra levels, and the hub is a pleasant place, and this is more or less its last hurrah. But the seams of the game and its troubled development via the Xbox deal falling through shows a bit with very blatant padding like this. The final journey to the brain tumbler reveals something. Raz sees a vision or a premonition of a mad scientist, Dr. Lobato, removing the brains of his fellow campers. Sasha and Milla are taken away on official Psychonaut business, which is very obviously a cover for them to be taken by the villain, leaving Raz and Ford to deal with the presumed threat alone, although Ford is unable to leave the camp as he has to babysit all the brainless campers. As the campers start disappearing, the game very quickly shifts to the endgame. Yeah, this game's not very long, although the endgame does comprise more than half of it. Night falls over the camp, populating it with enemies, and while you still can explore and gather, beyond Ford's sanctuary and the shop, there's really nothing of major importance to find. The lakefront serves as the gateway to everything else important in the game, but first, Raz, who cannot swim, needs to make it to the island at the center. Something from beneath the lake is taking the other campers, who have all gone missing, and Raz goes to the bottom to explore it, running along the lake bed in a bubble created by Ford. The segment is presented in one of the most unique ways I've ever seen, although I guess I've seen similar in Pac-Man World of all games. Most of the underwater section is presented in the second person from the perspective of a giant lungfish monster in the lake and is a fairly tight platforming chase sequence. While this game is never like Mario Galaxy in terms of its platforming, the creativity shines hard and carries the game hard. After a fairly jank fight with the lungfish where it needs to be baited into clams to get it stuck allowing Raz to hit it, he can finally enter the first of the unstable mental worlds, and it's fantastic. Lungfishopolis is all style and writing, and much less focused on teaching new moves or even the gameplay in general. In the mind of the lungfish, Raz is the kaiju Goggalor, a giant monstrosity stomping through town. As a level, it's a simple matter of stomping through everything, kicking around tanks, and climbing an occasional building. Raz's weight is appropriately displayed through sound and screen shakes, which is really fun in the way that the Godzilla games of the era were, but you just don't have to do all that much, and there isn't a lot to think about. This level's carried by how funny it is. The cries of the lungfish begging Raz not to step on the lungfish orphanage, the news broadcast spewing propaganda bragging the might of the navy that Raz easily swats away, and of course the lungfish only have a navy, they live in the water. Their planes are the flying wing of the lungfish navy. The level holds itself constantly for silly gags as lungfish talking heads decry Goggalor the Destroyer and turn around telling the lungfish to kidnap psychic children, as the lungfish has been created by Dr. Lobato to do. While simple, it's one of the most entertaining bits of the game, and also ends in a big reveal. Coach Amara is the alleged hero of Lungfishopolis, and is a suspiciously egg-shaped parody of Ultraman. Yeah, it's Coach Oleander, he's behind it all. The reveal is a bit matter of fact, I suppose. The game is just like, yeah, of course he's evil, sure, why not? The fight against him is surprisingly complex for what is functionally the first real boss. He has a lot of attacks with specific responses, whether that's using the shield to deflect lasers, using the shield to guard against a giant area of effect blast, or dodging dives, although the fight isn't the frustrating mess that the later big encounters are. You kind of just dodge or shield and then attack him a couple times. Freeing the lungfish from the control of Oleander and Lobato, it actually reveals itself to be a pretty cool girl.
The name given to me by my people.
And what name is that, noble lake creature?
Her name is Linda, and she offers to ferry you to the island in the center of the lake. While sort of being its own hub, it's only about the size of one section of the camp and doesn't have much to find outside of the brains of other campers, which can be turned in for health upgrades, and the final few levels, all of which are located pretty close together. Immediately upon arriving, you meet Boyd. Boyd is, apparently, the security guard.
I've been fully trained.
He is trained. Of Thorny Tower's insane asylum. Kinda like that thorny tower you had to climb in the brain tumbler. Boyd suffers from paranoid delusions, fairly obviously meant to be schizophrenic, although I doubt anyone involved would risk saying that nowadays. In his world, the Milkman Conspiracy is the most interesting by far. Besides two mini-bosses and a boss fight, the world lacks combat. In fact, the level almost entirely lacks platforming too, instead leading wholly into the adventure game stuff. The streets of the simple suburb in Boyd's mind are littered with men in black posing as construction workers, widowers, and assassins, but having the right items is enough to fool them, allowing Raz to obtain more and more items to push forward, including some wildly clever uses of the new clairvoyance power, which lets Raz see himself through the eyes of another character, use to figure out codes, see himself from above to get through a maze from the perspective of a crow, and navigate the dark using security cameras, all of which use pretty wild second-person perspectives. The level also just happens to be really funny, as Boyd rambles randomly generated nonsense about the milkmen. The men in black attempt to blend in, with the electrician ones talking about how much they love electricity, the assassins at the book depository talking about their job of killing important figures and how they sometimes work for the government, and the construction workers catcalling imaginary women. And all Raz needs to do to blend in is say, "This is my stop sign. I am a construction worker." Everything is charmingly disjointed and weird. Cameras hover about and pop out of bushes to take pictures of suspicious behavior. A Girl Scouts parody form a resistance to revive the milkman, whose milk is actually Molotov cocktails. I love it. And of course, Boyd is the milkman. He has to deliver his milk. Milkman Conspiracy is only broken up by more normal gameplay a few times. The Nightmare mini-bosses really do come out of nowhere. Earlier in the game's life cycle, they were meant to be a more recurring thing, having escaped from Milla's mind, but here they just pull Raz into hell and fight him at seemingly random points, and are fought simply by throwing their bombs back at them after stunning them, which is a good enough mechanic for a fight that takes a bit of thinking to work out, but is certainly less cool the second time you're forced to do it in the span of like 20 minutes. The Scoutmaster is a boss almost entirely fought in the second person, utilizing clairvoyance to see in the dark, and it's a cool gimmick admittedly, and also ridiculously disorienting, and a touch unpleasant. She moves around a lot, and to hit her, Raz needs to climb a staircase while dodging various projectiles, which leads to taking a lot of hits. I think this fight may be a case of too ambitious for its own good. Awakening the milkman turns Boyd back to normal, kinda. It turns him into an arsonist, which as evidenced by his emotional baggage slideshows is normal, but it's close enough for now. Raz pretty much immediately meets Gloria from there, a theater actress and former child star who's fallen into a deep psychosis after falling from the limelight, and her stage also has a lot of weird and creative ideas, if a little more contained. Life is a stage, or in this case, Gloria's mind is a stage, and her inner muse refuses to act thanks to negative reviews, and being a general drama queen. Her muse running loud recordings of crying to generate pity is a really fun gag. Most of the level takes place in a fairly small stage area, with the gimmick being that the set and mood can be changed for the scene at hand, with 6 sets that can each be played in happy or sad moods, where switching back and forth changes small bits of the set to allow Raz to progress, gain new scripts, and advance to later sets, although playing it in the sad mood also adds enemies to each scene. The play takes a really interesting delve into Gloria's past, more so than almost anyone else in this game, whether that being how her mother abandoned her over an abusive boyfriend, how she was always trying to live up to her mom, and her dreams of her mother returning to her, which is both fun and rather sad, and makes the whole thing very interesting, even if not as funny or gameplay intensive as other sections of the game. The level does swing back around to gameplay though eventually, as by manipulating the sets, Raz can reach the catwalks, where a mysterious phantom, who is definitely not the obviously evil critic, has been attempting to get the show shut down, and it's just refreshing, solid platforming, which has been gone for quite a while. Before ending in a boss fight with the critic, even the game treats this as a non-reveal, which is kind of fun in its own right. It's a fine boss, you dodge his projectiles, knock him down by lighting floodlights on the catwalks, and punch him. It's fine. Killing the critic allows Gloria to move on, and as such, she kinda just wanders off, and it's on to the next one. I will say, the game does feel a bit rushed at the end. Not that the game isn't extremely high quality, but tucking 4 of the last 5 worlds within a stone throw of each other while most of the campground goes unused feels less like a choice and more like, well, this is what we have done. On to Fred Bonaparte, the descendant of Napoleon Bonaparte, who has given up on life due to losing too bad at Waterloo World, a board game based on the real-life board game Terra Mystica. Fred is locked in an endless cycle of losing games to his ancestor, and only Raz can break the streak and get his mojo back. Like, Austin Powers, basically. It's like the plot of Austin Powers. Strong and silly gimmicks really define this half of the game, with this world consisting of 3 size tiers: life size with Fred and Napoleon, which is used to get a few key items; small size, where Raz can explore the board at its level and eventually move pieces around the board to actually win the game; and micro size, where most of the major gameplay takes place, allowing Raz to interact with the pieces and recruit them to the battle through adventure game shenanigans, getting them weaponry, food, or clearing enemies from the area. It's a bit more of a blend than Milkman Conspiracy is, featuring pretty regular bits of platforming combat to get key items, although funny enough, Waterloo World lacks any bosses, unlike Milkman. One of the cleverest elements of the stage is that the middle layer is essentially fast travel. While you're occasionally forced to go up to small size anyway in order to move pieces around, which builds bridges, defeats enemies, and eventually captures the castle to finish the stage, it also lets Raz get around quickly. Raz can shrink down at any landmark, making it the easiest way to get around the fairly large map, which is extremely unique as far as the fast travel system goes. As fun as the level is, there isn't actually that much to say about it. It leans into the adventure game stuff in a fairly straightforward way, and the interaction and jokes with the pieces are fun and cute, but moving the pieces around is a linear affair, and Napoleon is cured, which in his case means he takes a nap and there's one more to go before the end game. Edgar is a painter who experiences severe artist block as a result of getting cucked by Chad in high school. Redditor inclusion years before Reddit. Black Velvetopia is fucking gorgeous. Itself based on black velvet paintings, a sort of kitschy style that was popular in the 50s and then re-popular in the 70s, where brightly colored paintings would be done on black velvet to up the contrast. The style was brought back to prominence at the time by a dude named Edgar Lieteg, and would eventually become extremely popular in Mexico, which also ties in the world's very Latin American inspired elements, but also elements inspired by like Spain itself, but you know, whatever. Bullfighters, luchadors, guitars, roses, and skeletons. The dark colors and neon highlights set the world apart so far visually. It's great. Unfortunately, the level and its gimmick are probably my least favorite of the back half of the game. Outside of a small entry room where Edgar resides, and which leads to the finale, the world is a large ring with a bull, El Odio, who quickly runs laps, and if he hits Raz, pushes him back to the previous nook or cranny. The level all takes place in the margins of this center donut, and there's rarely anything that interesting to do. An occasional puzzle or bit of platforming to push forward and some random enemies to fight, while being punished pretty obnoxiously for any slip-up. The ultimate goal is to defeat the 4 luchador mini-bosses, Tiger, Dragon, Eagle, and Cobra, who are all variants of each other. The first 3 are all fought by dodging their signature moves and then retaliating, and Cobra can only be damaged by first hitting him with a confusion grenade, which is unlocked by aiding Dingo the bullfighter, and can also be used to temporarily pause El Odio. It's a shame the level is tedious too, because the story stuff is maybe the strongest it gets here. There's some very funny poker-playing dogs who've been separated by El Odio, and they sell paintings that can be used to create shortcuts around the area while chuckling about how hard they're scamming you. And Edgar has a really strong arc that isn't simply just fixing their mental disorders, as it's revealed El Odio is Edgar, as he transforms due to his rage and hurt for being cucked by Dingo the bullfighter. Mid-boss fight, after sticking El Odio with spikes by throwing them at him, Raz realizes the true issue is Edgar's inability to let go, and he needs to use confusion grenades on Dingo to throw the spikes back at him. However, this isn't an immediate fix for the issue as it has been for the other characters. Edgar is sane enough to appear in his own mindscape and still holds on to that anger briefly before finally coming to terms with it and letting go himself, moving himself beyond his issues with Raz's aid, rather than Raz just going in and immediately fixing him, which is a very mature and sweet finale for the character. With items gathered from the 4 patients at the asylum, Raz can disguise himself and reach the asylum's upper floors, which serve as the last hurrah for the platforming, with some really tight jumps, perilous climbs, and way too many exploding rats that honestly kill the pace a little bit. I love that you can occasionally see something following you if you turn around real fast or just in the corner of your eye. It caught me off guard the first few times, and I thought I was genuinely imagining it or the lighting was freaking out, until I found a spot that I could replicate it at and investigate closer. At the top is the mad scientist Dr. Lobato, who bullies the kindly Shigor into collecting brains for him under threat of harming her turtle, Mr. Pokelope. The reveal that Mr. Pokelope is a sentient, intelligent, talking turtle after you rescue him is very, very funny. Lobato's easily defeated, but Coach Oleander isn't as much of a pushover and places his brain into a tank, which are kind of the ultimate threat of his plan. A series of psychic tanks that can easily control and destroy anything. They can't be much of a threat though, as for as cool as the spectacle of this battle is, the boss fight ain't that hot. Simply throwing rocks at bigger rocks to remove them so you can burn fences so you can throw rocks at the brain. And despite your victory, Oleander still knocks Raz's brain out. However, in a fun twist, Raz can throw his own brain psychically into the tank, causing his and Oleander's memories to mix together and form the final world, the Meat Circus. Visually, the Meat Circus is perfect. It's uncomfortably gory, disgusting, and strange, with circus tents surrounding butchery equipment, sausage grinders, and horrifying zombie bunny enemies lurking around. Story-wise, it's a nice conclusion, honestly. Like Raz's own hang-ups with his father, who he sees as being dismissive and controlling because of his disdain for psychics, we see a young Oleander, a cheerful boy who loves his pet bunnies, although his father only sees them as another source of food, traumatizing little Ollie. And the two work through their daddy issues together, fighting off monstrous versions of their own fathers. And in gameplay, there's a reason this level is fairly infamous. Meat Circus is a collection of gameplay styles that fall outside of Psychonauts' strengths. Whereas most of the levels in this game play with a mixture of adventure game and action platforming, often leaning one way or the other pretty heavily, the level instead focuses energy in really weird places, beginning on pretty much everyone's least favorite, an escort mission. Little Ollie's attempting to catch his rabbit needs to be protected from the butchered rabbits as he does, and to its credit, there is a little bit of platforming between the 4 or 5 segments of this, but if Ollie dies, it all starts over, and boy, those rabbits can sometimes get into rhythms that strike him right as his post-hit invulnerability ends, making it extremely difficult to get to him in time, if not outright impossible. And it gets exhausting very fast to redo over and over. Like, at best it takes at least 10 minutes. The next segment features Raz's image of his father as he's forced to go through an acrobatics course, jumping between swing poles, tightrope walking, climbing walls, all mechanics that have briefly been part of the game throughout, but so insignificant that they really didn't bear mentioning until now. In a vacuum, the segment isn't terrible, and the extra checkpoints added in the Xbox, PlayStation, and Steam versions certainly don't hurt, but also the big finale focuses on this stuff as opposed to the platforming and adventure stuff the game is actually about. Then it's time for the 3 bosses. The bosses in this game have never been a highlight, sort of obligatory with a few cute ideas, and while it makes sense to end on something big, 3 might be a little bit much. The butcher fight, Ollie's father, is a simple affair of running from him and shielding against his attacks until he gets stuck, then climbing his arm. The second fight adds Raz's mental father into the mix, lighting the butcher on fire and making him unclimbable, instead needing to rely on throwing burning spikes Raz's father throws back at the butcher to stop him, and then fighting both fathers combined into one. Raz's real father awakens his own psychic abilities out of concern for his son and comes to help, with him expressing his fear of losing his son as the reason for his harshness, and being taken aback at Raz's mental image of him, which is a nice conclusion for Raz's emotional journey throughout the game. And the fight is waiting for a timer to count down while running from the fathers, at which point you turn into a very cool looking giant Raz made of electricity and pound on them and repeat a few times. While none of these bosses are outright bad, none of them are very satisfying as a finale for the game either. The whole level just kind of misses the point. Platforming is barely present, adventure game stuff is gone altogether. It's a nice conclusion story-wise, as Raz and Oleander move past their childhood trauma and become better people, with Oleander reforming his life, which is followed up in the second game, but it's a pretty awful conclusion for the game as a video game. Imagine if Mario 64 ended on like a skateboarding segment from Tony Hawk, or like Mario Sunshine ended with you driving a boat around. Oh. Despite a subpar finale and a few other small issues, Psychonauts is a wonderful game. It's a solid 3D platformer with lots of creative ideas at its base level, and frankly genius level concepts across the board. The adventure game elements and the very funny, fun, and silly writing keep the traditions of old LucasArts era games alive with charming characters, touching and funny plots, and they also bring in an element that's almost entirely unique for the platforming genre. There's no growth or humor in Super Mario 64. It's a fun-ass game, but it's not much more than a game. There isn't anything like Psychonauts out there, and no one's really tried to do it again, besides Double Fine again. And that alone would make it interesting. That it's so well written, so creative, so unique visually, are all just a way to hammer that home. There's stuff I don't like. The combat is stiff and breaks the pace a bit. A few levels don't work for me, like Black Velvetopia, despite the visuals. And it's kind of weird that the hub world is basically scrapped after a lengthy tutorial in favor of a tiny area where everything is seconds apart. But those are issues of a game that went through a lot of struggle just to exist from a studio that was trying to get its footing, and would go on to do plenty of great things in the future. It's really hard not to fall for Psychonauts. It's the whole package, wrapped in shiny, beautiful charm. With ideas so wacky and weird you can't wait to pull back another layer and see more. It's one of the most unique games of its genre and its era, and I wholeheartedly think you should experience it just to see the humor, the jokes, the way it all unfolds. It's fantastic.